organizers, to the Caldo for organizing this conference. And I'm really delighted to be here to speak in the panel Post-Conflict and Digital Media. And I'm showing this first slide, which is an image of the Canadian lake, Lake Erie, with its waves frozen. So you have a little bit of sense of the Canadian context. In a way, this already speaks to a little bit of conflict, since the United States thinks the Great Lakes are theirs. And so the Canadian context is both particular and diverse. And due to its geography bounded by two great oceans, Canada has known relative peace on its own land, partly because we do our dirty work elsewhere. But in many ways, we are still in conflict, even though conflict in at least the English part of Canada is it's maybe difficult to see, and that conflict really continues through issues around First Nations, land claims, environmental concerns, and an increasing wealth gap. Canada is also a country of immigrants, so the notion of post-conflict is very apt, since many of the immigrants and Canadians came to Canada due to conflict, whether political or economic. And so I'll be presenting my work, but I've been working with technology over a number of years, but we'll speak particularly about a project called Hybrid Bodies, a unique interdisciplinary project that looks at the non-medical, i.e. the emotional and the psychological effects of transplant on recipients. And that project is very much related to the notion of post-conflict, in particular the trauma on the body, and in many ways can be seen, I think, as a metaphor for issues of conflict that is pertinent to this conference. The Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye once said that all poets, and I'll exchange poets for artists, are licensed liars, and that the poet is not heard but overheard. And I'm interested in the stories we tell as individuals and as cultures, the stories we tell ourselves about the technologies we use, and the meta-narratives that we find ourselves operating within, and those private, intimate stories often not included in those dominant narratives. So that intersection between lies and stories, fact and fiction, is a kind of core in my work. This is a very early project from 1992, which is entitled A Nomad Web, Sleeping Beauty Awakes, that was probably, I think, one of the first networked art projects in Canada. And it was really an attempt to create in this space, which at that time was text only. This is pre-web browsers, pre-keyboard, pre-color, pre-image, to create a dialogue. And I think that notion of dialogue is really important, and in some ways, site specificity. Jorge Fernandez Torres, the director of the Wilfredo Lam Contemporary Center in Havana, was recently in Montreal, and he spoke about works that he felt that artworks really needed to be not only site-specific, but context-specific, and also time-specific. And I certainly hope my works do that. And so this notion of dialogue is something, whether it's in this new space of the internet, in this case it was to try to create a conversation around issues of nomadism in an internet space, but it also can be a dialogue that's between an architectural site, a set of values, belief systems, a person, place, or thing. And so I have a long history of working with all levels of technology, from really redundant to state-of-the-art. And so this interest of the material and the immaterial, the analog and the virtual, has a long history. And so at the same time as I did a Nomad Web in 1992, I did an analog version called Talking Walls, Dialogue, Ingrid, and Plato, where I tried to create a space that mirrored all the things that virtual reality, which was the technology of the time, promised, to create an immersive environment that engaged the full human sensorium, and where the body, in this case a human body, was really implicated. And so I did this by creating a giant chalkboard in a number of galleries. There were bicycles, ladders, pillars that moved, things that were printed, things that were drawn. So that last slide was at the beginning of an exhibition in Montreal, and this one was at the end of an exhibition in New York. And that kind of moving between the analog and the virtual, really, I don't see it as a binary. I learn a great deal about interaction, actually, from many of my analog projects. I often work in existing sites with found or discarded objects, as well as with life forms such as humans, natural phenomena like tectonic plates and hermit crabs. In this case, this is a project, a collaboration with my colleague Barbara Lane, which was done in 1995. Again, this was with dial-up modem. So, but in this case, it was a project that involved simultaneous production of two textiles that reflected the seismic information of Los Angeles and Montreal. And so at that time, the information was translated through the internet and went to, this is a very old style kind of computer attached to a loom. Each day, the seismic information from one site was uploaded and then was translated into a weave structure. Of course, that's very possible because both weaving and computers are based on binary structures. And in many ways, many people think the Jacquard loom is sort of the forerunner of the contemporary computer. So at the end of it, the information was translated by specially designed software into a woven structure. And then at the end of it, so there you see the pattern that's been translated into the woven cloth. And at the end of the project, we had two 55, or I guess it'd be about 17-meter length cloths. One that represented the seismic activity of LA for the month of November in 1995, and the other the seismic activity of Montreal. And it's really interesting because people would look at this and they would say, nice scarf. And yet a seismologist could look at it and read it as information. And so that idea of what information we trust, the sense of a printed image, a video image, and yet a textile doesn't have that same sort of truth value. In a way similar to this is a kind of mapping of the project, but this is actually how I really conceived it. And somehow this gap between different kind of modalities of representing knowledge. Another early work was really very much interested in interaction. Also, in many ways, I think my work is more about amplification than invention. So at this point, I really wanted to amplify the interface. So I created two 14-foot-long knitting needles that you had to manipulate in order to trigger a video image. And it was an animation of a swimmer, so in some ways, it dealt a little bit with this aspect of reward. When you manipulated the needles, 4 water weights moved up and down, but if you wanted to see the image, you had to look ahead of you. If you wanted to see what was happening behind you, you had to look behind you. This project was also done in 1994 at the time of the first Gulf War, which I think was one of the first wars where the sense of war as a video game became really apparent. And so that idea of amplifying this interaction that we have with the technology and all the things that are invisible behind it. And that led me to another project called Digital Crustaceans Homesteading on the World Wide Web that involves both a live hermit crab, whose name is Pookie, and a Pookie is an arbitrary unit of measurement in cyberspace. And one of the things that hermit crabs are really interesting because they are born without a home. So they're one of the oldest creatures on Earth. Their DNA hasn't changed, so in a way they've avoided a kind of process which is very much part of technological and digital media discourse. And in some ways, this having been born without a home, they have to find a home, either in the abandoned shells of other crustaceans or even in old tin cans. And so in some ways, to me, they've become the perfect metaphor for the unhomed, whether it's the immigrant, the refugee, or the exile. And so he has 2 homes. One is in the terrarium, where his daily activities are tracked and make drawings for me. Another one is on Second Life. Unfortunately, we weren't able at that time to be an animal in Second Life, so we had to build shells that would go onto humans. So the hermit crab decides to find a home on the internet, and he thinks he's going to find it on the website, but he realizes that the web is really just almost like a shopping mall full of display windows. So he takes a voyage, and you can see him there, and he goes to explore the oceans and looks at the submarine-laid cables that constitute the material base of the internet. And one of the things he's quite disappointed about is that the internet does not take him to as many places as he would like to go. Now this map is from 2002, and you can see that, that the lines around Africa, there's only one line around Africa. Now that's changed a little bit, but so in this virtual open space, accessible to all, you can really see that it mirrors kind of the economic and political global structures. He then decides to go to outer space, and actually I'm very proud that my pet went to outer space, was the first hermit crab in outer space, and he explored there you might think I may be lying a little bit, explored this whole system of satellites. So again, that kind of relationship between a space that is constituted as virtual, which actually has a material base, not only in terms of the submarine-laid cables and the satellites, but also in the labor in creating the hardware that is often also invisible. This project, the Portable Sublime, is, in the last century, in this century, we've seen probably unprecedented mobility, whether by choice through travel or immigration or by force. political, economic, environmental reasons. So I was thinking in that way about, could we, in some ways, could we reclaim the sublime? Because the sublime is usually something, and there's been a great deal written about the technological sublime, but could we reclaim the sublime as something that does not mean denying our everyday lived experience, that does not deny kind of the weight of the past? And because technology, especially digital technology, is often predicated on the future, and I try to bring kind of the past and memory and history into it. So this is crushed glass that I found in Chicago, from an act of violence that I tried to make into something beautiful. And so this idea that wherever you go, or why you're forced to leave, that what you take with you is also that kind of space of the imagination, that critical space. And so, to kind of create provisional spaces of wonder. But that last one was made out of pool spaghettis. You know, they cost maybe $1 in a store, and they float in this water. But also this idea of the sublime, because as an experience, but that also doesn't ignore the past. In this case, also that implication of technology before. In the First World War, radio was absolutely essential in allowing Hitler and Nazi Germany to rise to power. And of course, the internet was developed first by the American military. Oh, that's a working waterfall in a suitcase. The next project is called Symphony 54 Shoes, Distant Echoes. And again, it's using, it's 54 shoes, pairs of shoes, with toe and heel taps added to them that are used for tap dancing. But the shoes actually don't dance. They're connected to tubular magnetic sensored solenoids that, when activated, pull down and create a noise. So that in some cases they do actually dance, but not in the way they were originally intended. Also, because the shoes were all collected from secondhand stores, they have different weight, they have different sounds, so they impact on the sound. And I was really interested in those sense of, in some ways, of presence of people that we don't know about. And this is, I think, particularly relevant in Canada, where everything, particularly wars and conflict, happen outside of Canada. So, and in this case, it was very important for me that this project not be interactive, that these shoes not perform for us, that we have to listen to them. That installation has now changed. Another project is called Pinocchio's Dilemma, and I was really influenced. Many years ago, I read Eduardo Galeano's Genesis Memory of Fire, and it was probably one of those lightning moments. It was it's a book that tells the history of the Americas, but it's presented as fiction. And yet it includes from history the traditional, like, kind of Western history of conquest, but also creation tales from the Aztecs, from the Navajo. And so this idea of who gets to determine what's a story, what's a lie, what's a history, was very important. So I created these giant tongues that moved, that I wanted to be really sort of beautiful and sensual, and then a nose that moved, Pinocchio's nose that moved. This is probably the only project I've had that people have licked, which doesn't taste good. There's also something, as you can probably see, this idea of a very material and very sensual practice in the work that I think is actually very important, to kind of materialize technology, to bring it into the material and physical realm, to not make it other or outside. In 2005, I had this great opportunity to go to medical textile labs in the eastern coast of the United States. And this one particular lab, they were making medical textiles for use within the human body. So one of the things they were producing, this is a braiding machine. They were braiding veins to put into the body to attach severed veins. They were also weaving a human aorta that would be inserted by catheter into an existing aorta to strengthen it. They were also knitting material that would attach a heart valve to a patient. And one of the things that I found out during this research trip is that there are mechanical heart valves, but there are also biological heart valves, and most of those heart valves come from pigs. So humans have a very deep and close relationship with pigs and cows, which is not maybe quite as romantic as we might like to seem. And it also became clear that the medical community now has also become farmers, because where do these pigs come from? So now there's this whole other, somewhat invisible industry of farming for medical purposes. And that led me to a project called Bestiary. And so I've often had the sense that technology is naked, and I wanted to, that it's drifted from its animal roots. So I wanted to give it a pelt. And so I constructed this sort of neoprene surface that looks like fur, but is highly synthetic. And so I created a number of beasts. And some of it is that technology is often presented to us, and even the image of the cyborg, that combination of machine and human, is hard, hairless, dry. But these researchers sort of show that we are actually much more connected to the animal world. So I wanted to kind of create works that were more involved, what we would consider a human-animal-machine hybrid. Some of these works are interactive, some act on their own accord, some don't move at all. And so in this case, the movement is very, very, very subtle. And so again, I wanted to play, since interactivity has now become a bit of an on-off kind of norm, at least maybe I find participants in North America maybe have that response. So I wanted to make something that would be very subtle, very engaging, hopefully engaging. And this led me to the most recent and the last project I'm going to speak about, which is called Hybrid Bodies, and an artistic investigation into the effects of heart transplant in recipients. And few organs are as charged as the human heart. It's seen as both the seat of human identity and the archetypal symbol of love. It's an organ that has been ascribed qualities and association far beyond its anatomical functions. And since the first transplant in 1967, the technical aspects of transplantation are now routine. But what is less known is the actual non-medical effects, the more psychic, emotional, and psychological effects of transplant on recipients. And I was fortunate enough to work with, I was one of 4 artists to participate in a transdisciplinary project that was based at the Peter Monk Cardiac Centre in Toronto, Canada, headed by Dr. Ross, a chief cardiologist, called PIP, the process of incorporating a transplanted heart. It also involved a health researcher, a sociologist, a transplant psychiatrist, and a philosopher. And so they invited artists, and that was really unique that they approached, the scientific team approached artists to work with them. And they didn't want us to illustrate their findings. They wanted us to present work based on their findings to bring it to a larger public. And unfortunately, you can't see who they are, but this is actually what they look like. One of the things in the medical community, there's quality of life measurements for life post-transplant. And in the past, it's always been a paper survey or an audio interview. And in the audio, they found that most people say they're fine, they're great. But the experience of the doctors and the nurses was that this wasn't actually true. And so for the first time, the medical team decided to use audio-visual interviews. And what they noticed was this enormous gap between what people said and what their body said. So they'd be saying, on paper it says I'm great, but they'd be like, I'm great. And so it was a pretty unique opportunity. We had to work we were given access to these video interviews because of ethical clearance and issues. We had to go to Toronto to actually see the work there. One of the things for me that was most striking in this was the idea of the gesture of these people. And there's kind of this really interesting duality, and a lot of the notions of kind of conflict are part of this. For one thing, heart transplantation creates a great trauma on the body. The one thing is that this trauma then becomes invisible. And in some ways, it's a little bit like invading armies. One of their first tactics to do is to erase all aspects of the culture that preceded them. And this, in some ways, this kind of erasure of having undergone this trauma also has impact on the recovery of transplant patients. Jean-Luc Nancy, the French philosopher, had a heart transplant, and he wrote a book called L'intrus, The Intruder. And so in some ways, he not only saw the transplanted heart as an intruder, which is, I think, also has some parallels with how many people view new immigrants, but also he saw his own heart as an intruder. He didn't recognize this failing heart. And there are so many things that are really based around a dyad. There's this really central notion of the donor, the recipient, the healthy heart, the unhealthy heart, the body wanting the heart, the immune system rejecting it, and also this notion of gift, the gift of life, like really a second chance, but the gift is this incredible burden that is accompanied by guilt, and also that the other notions of really wanting to know the donor. Most people who have transplants celebrate their birthdays on the date of their transplant. And there is this real desire to project onto the donor and the donor family. So it's a really kind of fascinating field. So one of the projects, I did 2 projects based on this. One is a sound work called A Part of Me, and in this case it used transducer sensors. While I was at the Toronto General looking at the footage, I was once in a little cubicle with a headset on, and I spent 3.5 days listening to very emotional, very powerful stories. And it really made me want to work with something that was in the body and of the body. So I decided the transducer sensors would be an interesting idea because they're not actually speakers. It's the same technology as ultrasound. So they use the bones, anywhere, your bones, to kind of resonate sound. So you would place a transducer, to hear it best, you would hear it probably, I hear it best here and at the back of my head. Some people can hear it on their chin. And it's something too that you can walk in the world and no one else can hear it but you. And I think that's very much the similar of anyone post-trauma. Many people don't have the scars, visible scars of trauma, whether it's medical, political, economic. And so this idea of, and so I doubled up the voices and I hired actors and you could put multiples of them on the body. The other project I worked on was a series of videos, and because I felt the medical team and scientific team had gone so out of their comfort zone to work in this project. In fact, the chief cardiologist had to finance this project for 8 years before they finally got funding for it. And she thought she might be committing career suicide to deal with something that dealt with not necessarily hard science and the more emotional and psychological effects. Because in the medical community, it's usually very divided. It's either psychiatric or biomedical. And so to have something that was like that was very different. So I did 6 segments, and I worked with 2 dancers, partly because I felt the medical team had gone out of their comfort zone to such a great degree. I felt I needed to go out of mine. I'm not a choreographer, but I tried to take some of what I thought were the really key elements from the research. So this idea of the grasp and the push-pull, the body needing the heart, the immune system rejecting it, the donor wanting it but being afraid of it. And so needing it, being thankful for it, but also feeling guilty about it. I happened to know 2 dancers in the dance program at Concordia, and that was why I felt comfortable to approach them. And we used one of the black boxes at Hexagram, and it was a very interesting process to just say, okay, you're dealing with weight or burden, and kind of plan it out from there. This next segment I gave them sort of the instructions of one of you, you're a healthy heart, and you beat. And the other one, you're a dying heart. And so how do we translate this into movement? I also use, in a way, some of the colors, although it's not, in this case, it's not necessarily really black and white. A healthy heart is a very vibrant, beautiful red, and a heart that a transplant patient, when a transplant patient needs a heart, is this very small ochre yellow colored apart. And at that stage, usually the patient can only, has trouble breathing, has trouble, even lying down makes them tired. And they essentially are sort of drowning in their own fluid. And so in many ways, this project, it's an ongoing project. We've been invited to participate in the next version of it, which is called The Gift of Life and Anonymity. Because again, this is not a singular contained project. It's not only the experience of the recipient, but the experience of the donor families. And that issue of anonymity causes in the donor family great distress. In a way, it's not unlike in maybe 10, 20, I think 20 years ago in Canada, adopted children were not allowed to find their adopted parents, and for many of them that caused great distress. So, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to be here.